Nigel Farage won his by-election in Clacton, but he's not out of the woods yet. Not only is he facing the continuation of his investigation by the Parliamentary Standards Committee, which might result in another by-election, which opposing parties might actually run in this time, but he also finds himself at the centre of an influence campaign waged by the Telegraph, the Mail, the Times and other outlets to thwart an attempt to cooperate with Restore Britain, but also to push Zia Yusuf out of reform to make a pact with the Conservatives ahead of the next election more likely. And it seems that some within Reform are in danger of falling for it. So I'm just going to lay it all out here so that you don't get fooled again. And it's fortunate to see that both Restore Britain and Zia Yusuf himself are wise to this, because criticisms of Zia Yusuf, though you may have, I've certainly had mine in the past, you can't doubt the sincerity of his contempt for the Conservatives after 14 years of betrayal. So we open with the fact that Nigel Farage is in a vulnerable place. This piece in, again, The Telegraph, written by the same author who wrote that hit piece on the bunch of attractive right-wing women a little while ago that we covered on the channel, notes that, according to YouGov, Farage's latest net favourability rating stands at -46. This is the lowest figure recorded since its tracker launched about 10 years ago. Kemi Badenoch's favourability rating, by contrast, is just -11, so you can sort of see the framing going on here. And there's no doubt that Farage's approval ratings have taken a bit of a hit recently, says Luke Trill, chief executive of More in Common. He's facing a battle on two fronts. On one hand, Farage must continue to appeal to what Trill calls moderate wavering reform voters who believe that things aren't working in Britain and that it might be worth giving them a go. Some of these voters have been put off by the £5 million gift from Christopher Harborne and are increasingly tempted by a return to either the Tories under an increasingly assured Badenoch, see the ego massaging that the press are doing for Kemi and the Tories, or Labour under Burnham's new leadership. But meanwhile, Farage must also contend with the fact that there are as many as a quarter of Reform's 2024 voters who are now drawn to Restore, and its uncompromising language around immigration. And as we'll see later, there are people that are saying, well, a pact with Restore is impossible, but instead you should pursue voters from Labour, the Lib Dems and the Tories. Now, as we saw from the Manchester mayoral election, the Tory and Reform votes are pretty much mutually exclusive, because there were thousands of Tory voters who could have, at no cost to themselves, put Reform down as their second preference on the ballot paper, and they didn't. That's because the people who were going to defect from the Tories to Reform ahead of election day have basically already decided. Some might put an X in the box next to the Reform candidate if they're doing well in their constituency and they want to tactically keep Labour out, which means that Reform just need to make their appeal to the broader public and consolidate their own base, rather than estrange it as they have done to Restore Britain. Something I warned them about time and time again, but those warnings weren't heeded and now they're being listened to a little bit late. But first, this video is sponsored by Rumble Wallet. Britain is fast becoming the Soviet Union, where everything you say or buy online is being watched for potential wrongthink, and despite the Constitution, my friends across the pond in the United States aren't faring much better either. That's why libertarian nerds invented crypto, so you can have a say over your funds and what you spend them on. After the 2008 financial crash, Bitcoin was designed to be an alternative to banks, so that you couldn't be debanked, have transactions denied, services withheld, or funds put on hold. If you've ever been refused a bank account because you're a politically exposed person, you know how frustrating that is. Which is why the guys at Rumble have developed Rumble Wallet, to simplify your crypto transactions and make sure you remain uncancelable. You can use Bitcoin, dollar-backed stablecoins, or even digital gold backed by real gold. It connects with MoonPay, which is registered with the Financial Conduct Authority. So you can safely link your debit card, credit card, or bank account and be ready to use it within minutes. And for a limited time, you can start your Rumble wallet with $20 in US stablecoin. You can use that to tip your favorite Rumble creators, like me. Just enter my exclusive promo code Connor20 when you sign up. Rumble ensures we all have a platform to speak about the threats facing our respective countries without the fear of cancellation. They're good guys, and if they weren't doing the right thing, I wouldn't be working with them. So thanks to them for sponsoring this video. Download Rumble Wallet, try it for yourself, and remember to use my code Connor20 for $20 in US stablecoin to tip to your favorite creators. Restrictions apply. There are a limited number of entries available. Terms and conditions also apply. See the description below or visit rumble.com/promo official rules for details. And if you want to get all of my content without ads, you can subscribe to my Substack for as little as £5 per month. It's linked down in the description, and it's also where I'm posting exclusive essays and updates. Now let's get back to the video. Nevertheless, there is still a possibility, because of the olive branch that Rupert Lowe has extended, to reconsolidate that base with a credible offering on immigration and some contrition about how you treated those voters and Rupert Lowe specifically. But it doesn't seem that that's happening. And so when Farage is faced with this which way Brexit man conundrum, containment with the Conservatives or reunification of the right with Restore, it's annoying that he decides to fall back on rote-learned post-war narratives as if the Telegraph has beamed its slop directly into his head, and he compares Restore Britain to Oswald Mosley and mentions Cable Street.
There was a bigger Restore vote than I thought, but I think even there, I think the truth is beginning to come out. That, what Rupert Lowe says and what the acolytes around him say are increasingly becoming two very different things, and there is quite a sinister edge.
There's quite a nasty edge
to some of the young men around him. There is a very, very sinister edge, and things being said that by some of these acolytes that we've not heard in this country since 1936 and Cable Street, and the days of Mosley. And I'm being honest about that. Rupert can say what he likes, but the fact is, the party is increasingly being run by people who are bringing a certain toxicity into politics, which can only ever be a minority opinion. And I think those contradictions are coming to the fore.
So first of all, this isn't true, because if you don't think that Rupert Lowe is now on the same page as the young lads like Charlie, Harrison, Lewis and Josh in Restore after 2 weeks, and still going, of relentless hit pieces for racism, anti-Semitism, being the far right, then you just haven't caught up. There's a reason that Rupert Lowe didn't expel Charlie Downes from his position or the party when Nigel Farage made it a condition of forming a pact with Restore Britain. Now, the reason that Farage is making this comparison is because it's been presented to him by the Telegraph. Jake Wallace-Simons published this piece about a week ago. Jake Wallace-Simons has also published another hit piece today on the large swap theory, and it features me, and it mistakenly calls me the campaigns director for Restore Britain when I don't work for the party, and that's Charlie Downes' position. And he also didn't print my lengthy rebuttal when he made a request for comment in DMs, which I've now posted on X. The point being, I can't even discuss the contents of that article because YouTube will ban me for saying the direct phrases that it attributes support for to me, even though it's not correct. So I can't even defend myself against these smears, because if I attempt to do so, my livelihood will be taken away and my channel will get banned. But they can just lie about me in mainstream newspapers. So first of all, these attacks are not substantive, they're not truthful, and so you shouldn't believe them. But secondly, it's also a very poor strategy to use these kinds of slurs and comparisons to 20th century bogeymen, because the moment that they get bored doing it to the guy that you point out is to your right, Nigel, or anyone in Reform, then once that guy goes away, they'll just start doing it to you too, because you have given it power. You are using it as well, so you show that you are susceptible to media pressure and accusations of racism and anti-Semitism and being Hitler and Mussolini and Mosley all wrapped up into one neat fascist package. And you know why? I warn that. Because after Farage did that, you've then got Charles Moore in the Telegraph making those exact comparisons to Mosley. Charles Moore is a Tory operator. He was the person who supported Kemi Badenoch during the Conservative leadership election by saying having a black African woman lead the oldest political party in the world would be a sight for sore eyes. So literally DEI, literally saying, oh, the left can't call us racist because we're led by a Yoruba mammy. Well, they're going to call you racist anyway, so what now? He's also the guy in an episode of The Forge with my friend Harrison Pitt of Restore Britain, who said that Margaret Thatcher would have been wrong to act on Enoch Powell's popular sentiment about reversing mass post-war migration because it would be uncivilized to do so. I happen to think all the murders and rapes and the indignities suffered by our population as a result of third world migration are much more undignified than you potentially getting called mean names at a dinner party at the Carlton Club, Charles. Anyway, the reason I'm making this point is to show that these people are not credible, good faith actors. They will lie, they will omit your comment, they will twist your words, they will use your reputation as cannon fodder in their influence operation. And the influence operation at work in the Telegraph started with Allister Heath's piece on the 5th of August that Farage must reject Rupert Lowe's repugnant dance with white nationalism. And if you read through all the smears and slurs, you get to the bottom, as I predicted weeks ago, and Heath says that both Farage and Kemi Badenoch must continue to build multiracial, multi-religious, small c conservative coalitions and reject Lowe's repugnant dance of white nationalism and religious discrimination. If a deal is to be done, it will be between the Tories and Reform. So you have to be liberals, universalists. You can't draw distinctions, either category or quality, between groups of people, immigrants and natives, between different religions, even though we're a Christian country. And if you do, Allister Heath will command the Telegraph to write relentless hit pieces about you and participate in it himself. He will participate in this coordinated attack on your reputation to block your efforts at uniting with Reform, who are still the leading party in many polls, or at least the leading right-wing party in the polls, so that the Conservatives have a shot at getting back into government. This entire attack is an effort to reward the shepherds of the Boriswave with another term in government. And I'm sorry, I'm just not up for that. And anyone who has participated in this pile-on against Restore Britain on the Reform side has unfortunately fallen for this op. They did, ironically, telegraph it from a mile away, and now it's getting even more egregious. But fair enough, if you didn't see it coming, this is just explaining to you what's happening. And Allister Heath is open about this. In a recent interview he did with Jake Wallace-Simons on Jake's YouTube channel, he actually said, we need to excise, not just Restore Britain, but anyone who supports the idea that, for example, Muslims are less British than, actual British people. We need to excise them from the body politic, cut them out like a cancer. We need to contain them.
Which category of far right do I think is the most toxic? I think it's a very online, semi-intelligent demagogues who, are very fast at putting out posts that get 500,000, 1 million views, and gradually their views filter down and contaminate more of the mainstream. And that's why these people need to be isolated. They have to be cut out of the body politic. They need to be, everybody needs to understand that these people are not mainstream. And by the way, I don't want to sound like one of these censorious kind of centrists, I am not a centrist. I'm a radical person. With I believe in a restoration of conservatism and classical liberalism.
We have to conserve classical liberalism. That's right, I'm a radical. Because nothing says radical like suspending all value judgments about someone else's religion and conception of the good life, and believing that Britain is just one big vessel for anyone from anywhere to live exactly as they please. That's right, I'm a conservative. This is preposterous. But what you can see is that Allister Heath considers himself and the Telegraph to have sufficient imprimatur to hound people out of public life, to isolate, to cut out people from the body politic. He sees himself as an arbiter of acceptable political opinion. He sees himself as the hall monitor of what is considered respectable and mainstream. Despite the fact that, he's referring to people like me, presumably considering they keep writing articles about me, despite the fact that, in terms of views versus production budget operation, I'm blowing them out the water. And anytime that they release a hit piece, it's really irritating to have to refute just ridiculous falsehoods about me over and over again. It's particularly tiresome, but they lose credibility and subscribers every time they do it, because he can say, oh, I'm not mainstream or whatever as much as he likes. But if you're inventing obvious lies, if you're acting in bad faith, then people can detect that over time and you start losing your credibility. And if you want to blow your credibility, be my guest. But the reason they're doing this, at the expense of their own subscribers, at the expense of their own imprimatur, is because they believe they have the power to gatekeep politics. They believe, judging by Nigel Farage's falling for the slurs launched at Restore Britain, they believe they have the ability to influence politicians to sabotage certain deals between Restore and Reform, or prevent certain people from being heard by Reform, presuming they are the party of the next government, and also to nudge them towards getting back into bed with the Conservatives. And this is exactly what Allister Heath wrote on the 12th of August. He said, I'm fond of Nigel Farage, but why is he wasting time battling Count Binface in a useless by-election in Clacton? It won't solve any of his problems. I'm impressed by Kemi Badenoch. That makes one of you. But why is she accusing Reform of wokery? Why are the Tories and Reform so focused on obliterating each other rather than turning their firepower on the real opponents, the left? Because if Reform's voters are listened to, The Tories are not in a Venn diagram with reform. They certainly aren't a circle. They are the enemy. As Dominic Cummings pointed out, the ambition of some in reform is not just to win government, it's not just to reverse the Blairite Revolution, but is to destroy and punish the Conservatives for what they did to this country. The idea that anyone like Priti Patel or James Cleverly or Michael Gove would be welcome near a government that is designed to fix the problems they unrepentantly inflicted upon us is preposterous, though not to Allister Heath. And that's the purpose. Allister Heath is playing political cooties, mean girl politics. Oh, you can't sit at our table because you're ugly. So that it vacates the space for the Conservatives to come back to government. It's an influence operation, and currently some people in reform are falling for it. He writes, does the right have a political death wish, or is it too incompetent to know how to win? Are swathes of the electorate so angry with the establishment, so lacking in trust, so trapped in their own echo chamber, so convinced this country is finished, that they have given up on winning and merely want to vent and rage rather than seize power and rebuild? I wonder what's made them so angry about the Tories, Allister. Perhaps it's the way the Tories behaved for 14 years, and perhaps it's because the same people are in Kemi Badenoch's shadow cabinet, Kemi herself, who championed the Boriswave, who voted for net zero, who passed COVID lockdowns and all the tax rises, who said diversity is our strength and flew the trans pride flag from the Home Office. I wonder if it's because all those people are still in the shadow cabinet and are the prospective people you're encouraging reform to do a deal with. I wonder if it's because people can detect that if reform were to do a deal with the Conservatives, they would jettison their own reason for being. There are already too many Tory defectors in reform, some of which reform regrets. So the idea that the pathway to success is forming an alliance with the Tories, well, it isn't what the voters want, but it is what people with vested interests, who want to go to fancy dinner parties, who want to keep publishing in the Telegraph, who want to feel comfortably liberal and be held in the esteem of subversive traitors like Fraser Nelson. It's what they want to happen, even though it isn't good for the country. Heath writes, does that explain why a few have been tempted by Restore? Well, it's more than a few, it's 150,000, judging by recent membership counts, a vehicle for further vote-splitting and toxification of the public discourse. Okay, alright, you accuse it of vote-splitting. Brilliant, so let's merge. Oh, no, you've just spent the last 2 weeks crashing out about that, dedicating your newspaper's coverage to attacking random people in Restore Britain for doing, like, nicotine pouch ads that showed up on a website that you don't like, that they have no knowledge of. Or me, again, relentlessly, accusing me of all sorts of stuff that is just patently false. So, weirdly enough, I'm not going to take your accusation of vote splitting on face. Activism now operates in an online ecosystem characterized by the return of an oral culture centered around gossip and conspiratorial thinking, combined with a quasi-pagan ethic of might is right. This has rotted many brains. My brother in Christ, I am a Christian, and I believe in Christianity because I believe it is true, but that is a mutually exclusive truth claim, which means that I believe other religions are false. And if I say that, you're going to call me a racist and exclude me from your multiracial, multi-religious coalition that you want to build. I don't care about accusations of quasi-paganism. And also, when you say, oh, it operates in an online ecosystem, I wonder if you shut an entire generation of young men out of not just having a country, but opportunities to explain their concerns in mainstream publications. I wonder if they just shut up and go away. Oh no, they don't. It turns out they go on social media, and as autodidacts, they adapt to this new technology and they develop new means of communication like Substack and YouTube and podcasts, and they blow your readership levels out of the water by just yapping into a camera in their study. Yeah, it turns out that has an organic audience and an organic reach and more credibility than you do. Funny that, isn't it? But again, I'm arguing with a brick wall here, because that's not the purpose. The purpose is not to be consistent. The purpose is not to be persuasive. It is an influence organisation aimed at reform to get them to voluntarily gatekeep anyone to their right, or actually, just that which resonates with the views that their voters already have, to allow the Tories back into government. He says, as for Tory voters, some hate Farage so much they would rather Burnham stay in power than ever vote for reform. The Conservatives and Reform have a choice. As mainstream, non-racist parties... Oh yes, because at the moment, I really have my paramount virtue not being called racist by the left. After decades of the Pakistani grooming gangs covered up because of the misapplication of the word racism, I really care about the use of the word racism, which has no fixed meaning and no shared definition anymore. Yep, that's right. We should organise our political coalition around non-racism as we face becoming a hated minority in our own country, under the doctrine of anti-racism. No thanks. Anyway, he says, the Conservatives and Reform have a choice. they can either find an accommodation or go down together, betraying the country in the process. I think the Conservatives have already betrayed the country enough, and I don't think we should give them another opportunity to. He finishes with, the Western right is thus at a turning point, with a third act looming. If the Republicans, Reform, the Tories, and the rest fail because they cannot professionalise, cannot deliver, or are too divided, they will not be given a second chance. The far left will triumph, and the truly nasty, anti-Semitic, demagogic far right will emerge from the ashes of conservatism, inspired by the demented, fascistic ideologies of American or European extremists. It is hard to be anything other than deeply pessimistic about the West's future. Well, sorry, I'm actually willing to fight for my country and my children's future, regardless of what names you call me, especially because they're not accurate. But also, I just want to add one thing. If you wanted to fulfill the accusations of the most feverishly minded anti-Semites, then falsely accusing someone of anti-Semitism for weeks, and then not correcting the record when they disprove that, and using those accusations of anti-Semitism as a stick to beat them with to try and ruin their career as part of a broader political influence campaign to reward people that have ruined the country because they're your friends. I think that might make anti-Semitism more widespread, Allister. I think you might be doing exactly what you're accusing other people of. And this was always the goal. I mean, again, Tory House magazine, The Spectator, published an article with the byline by The Spectator. So this is the editorial position. This is the position of Michael Gove and presumably the editorial staff, though I'm sure not everyone was on board with this. It says, Nigel Farage has a hollow victory in Clacton and he needs to decide whether or not he wants to just campaign or govern. And what do they mean by governing rather than campaigning? Well, they say, last August, Reform was riding high. A year on, their ascension to Downing Street looks less certain. The poll lead has disintegrated, scandals are accumulating, progress has stalled. Meanwhile, Kemi Badenoch has improved her personal standing, and it comes from an increasing confidence and a command over her party, and they praise her basically for ejecting Robert Jenrick and making him Reform's problem, because it looks like the Tories are cleaning house. Never mind that, again, Priti Patel and James Cleverly are still in senior positions in the cabinet. And then they say, Reform has been squeezed by Rupert Lowe's Restore Britain. Farage seems unsure whether he wishes to outflank Lowe with pledges to deploy the Royal Navy in the Channel and to deport criminals to El Salvador, or take up his disgruntled ex-MP's offer of a truce. Rightly, this is a Spectator again. Remember, Michael Gove, censored my debate. Well, Freddie Sayers did at the very least. But also, Michael Gove, 14 years as Conservative minister, stood up at the dispatch box, said diversity is our strength. First thing he did when he became Spectator editor, endorsed Kamala Harris for the presidency. He said, rightly, Farage has said such a deal would not be possible while Lowe dabbles with darkness, allying himself with a coterie of young ethno-nationalists strident enough to deny the king's Britishness. So boring. And suggests Farage has been bought by Jewish interests. So, recycling the same slurs and smears propagated by the Telegraph to try to divide, restore and reform and push the Tories on reform. Farage often points to Canada, where a Reform Party overhauled and absorbed a Conservative one. But he also knows that doing so took 3 elections, at which the left triumphed over a divided right. If Farage sees his historic role as frustrating the Tories, then his personal vendetta is getting in the way of delivering the transformative government this country so desperately needs. Britain does not have 3 elections to wait. The right, in whatever permutation, just not restore Britain, must be ready to govern in 2029, or sooner if Burnham gambles on a snap election. Directly pushing a pact between Reform and the Conservatives. This is, again, the House magazines, the highest editorial positions in those magazines and newspapers of the Tory party, which Reform read, judging by Nigel Farage's reaction to Restore Britain. So, people in Reform are falling for this, and they're making a Conservative pact more likely. And this has been going on for quite some time. Before the Telegraph crash out, you had Nadine Dorries, yes, the same former culture secretary who said she'd throw Jimmy Carr in prison for a joke under the Online Safety Act, who defected to Reform a conference ago, and Farage welcomed her on stage, and again, there are plenty of people in Reform who'd rather wish she saw her own way out. But in her article, fabricating this conspiracy about a meeting between Rupert and the Conservatives, which went south, which is why he apparently offered Nigel Farage a pact. Rupert wasn't in the country on that day, he was flying out of Gatwick, so it literally didn't happen. This is just a total fantasy by Nadine Dorries. But it ends with her true ambition. She says, it's time for the Tories to act. They've spent a year channeling their energy into forming an alliance with Restore in order to crush Reform, but they need to refocus, put personalities aside, stop sniping at Reform, and negotiate with its charismatic vote-winning leader to lay the foundations of an unbeatable alliance. She wants Reform to be the vehicle by which Boris Johnson gets back into government. It's not that Rupert Lowe is working with the Tories and the Tories are bad, so we want to stop the Tories and Reform from getting back into government. It's that Rupert Lowe might work with Reform UK, and this would block Boris Johnson from coming back via the Tories to get into government. So Nadine Dorries doesn't want to punish the Tories. She wants to be the bridge builder between Boris and Reform to reward Boris Johnson for the Boriswave to bring him back into government, because for some reason he never called her back. And Boris is lurking in the background. This is a piece by Tim Shipman, again, in The Spectator, so I'm only using the sources that actually want to push this to show you that this is the influence operation at work, not just on Reform voters, but on Reform politicians. Tim Shipman observes that whoever coined the phrase Boriswave, it was an anon in a group chat with Kundli Drukpa and Max Tempers, but they've popularised it, has probably sunk Boris Johnson's chance of leading his party or the country. But those close to him say he's beginning to feel the pull of the political game. Multiple witnesses say Boris is driven by his hatred of Farage. When the Conservatives opened their new headquarters at Castle Lane in Victoria, shortly after Andy Burnham beat Reform in the Makerfield by-election, Boris Johnson spoke. Is it not wonderful, poetic, beautiful to see Reform now being devoured, hemorrhaging votes on the right to this party called Restore, which sounds like a sort of hair loss potion or something. Ha ha ha, aren't I smart? I'm Boris Johnson, I have 1 million Indians. Friends of Johnson say he's privately made the case that Farage comes with a whiff of sulphur. One close ally says Boris has made a lot of money and has a nice life, but he really hates Farage. He's in touch with Kemi, and I think you'll see him campaigning properly at the next election. He doesn't want Farage to be Prime Minister. But, knowing Boris Johnson, has no principles, just wants power. If there is an opportunity for Boris Johnson to crowbar himself back into government, leveraging the popularity of Reform as a backlash against him, then he will take it. Another long-standing friend says he does absolutely hate Nigel, and that has been exacerbated by Reform's personal attacks on him, mainly coming from Zia Yusuf. His main attack line is that they are a bunch of Kremlin crawlies. Ah yes, because everyone cares so much about Russia when we're staring down the gun barrel of demographic obsolescence, which you accelerated by 6 million immigrants in 6 years, Boris. And it's not just conspiratorial that Boris is waiting in the wings of Kemi, because donors from Boris are being funneled back to Kemi Badenoch. They believe that this is a worthwhile investment to continue Boris Johnson's legacy. One donor is Lord Bamford, who gave £150,000 to the Tory party. He was a generous donor to Boris Johnson before rumours began to swirl that he was moving to Reform UK, but clearly he now has faith that Kemi is in Boris's corner. And then lots of Tory MPs are now trying to urge Kemi to make a deal with Reform. The Telegraph reports a growing chorus of Conservative politicians hopes to unite the right, Tories and Reform. Tories aren't the right. An electoral strategy in which Reform or the Conservative candidates would stand aside in certain seats, while the parties would establish a non-aggression pact to avoid splitting the right-wing vote, leading to a coalition government. Calls for cooperation among the rival parties are becoming increasingly urgent amid speculation that Andy Burnham could call a snap general election to ratify his position. One Conservative MP told the Telegraph the national interest is served by preventing another Labour majority or a Labour-led hard-left coalition with the SNP, Greens and Lib Dems, so Conservatives and Reform must work together to avoid splitting each other's votes and maximise the number of seats they both win. The Conservative-Reform arrangement needs to be in place before the election. This is what they're trying to push, which could come sooner than expected, which is the rush to sabotage Restore Britain. And MPs, donors and key party figures from both sides agree the work should start soon. Hang on. MPs, donors and key party figures from both sides agree the work should start soon. So there are people working within Reform to push for a Tory merger. I assume these are the people that have facilitated the Tory defections or have courted Tory donors, or are leaking to the press trying to get Reform to expel members who are high profile and aren't so willing to work with the Tories, such as Zia Yusuf, which we'll get onto in a moment. Another Conservative MP agreed, saying it's absolutely essential that the right unite, because if they don't, the left certainly will. There has to be some accommodation between Conservatives and Reform at some point, but quite what form that will take is something that will need to be discussed down the line. So the conclusion is foregone, whether you like it or not, whether you would like an alternative to the Conservatives after they betrayed the country for 14 years. No, you're not getting that. People behind the scenes have too much money, too much reputation riding on this, and so they're going to push it, and they're going to destroy your reputation. They're going to try and chase you out of public life, excise you from the body politic if you disagree. So, God forbid you actually have an alternative to vote for. Containment is in full swing. Championed by the Telegraph. Another Tory MP explained, "It's critically important that those that share a range of views about the future of the country don't compete with each other. At some point, the penny will drop for both leaders, that they can't and won't win alone. When that happens, then a deal becomes more likely, in fact very likely. And they both, Badenoch and Farage, have to know that. Most sensible people in the party have reached this opinion too." Okay, so we're precluding the people that don't want to work for the Tories from being considered sensible. So that would include, just off the top of my head, Robert Jenrick, who now despises the Tories for the way that they've treated him, whether or not you, again, like Jenrick. Zia Yusuf, who is sincere in his hatred of the Tories, hence why he put down that deadline when Robert Jenrick defected, "No more Tories" by May, and I have heard some other Tory MPs tried to defect after that deadline and were swiftly told no by Yusuf and co. Ed Sumner and Matt McKinnon, again, two loyal employees of UKIP, the Brexit Party, now Reform, good lads, and James Orr, who, despite being friendly with some of the Tory defectors, cannot stand the Tories that are still in the camp, bar maybe one whose work he thinks is credible, but who had no intention of defecting. But the premise is, votes are a fixed pie, the Tories have some, Reform are the kid in the high chair who's decided he doesn't want to eat his greens and is throwing a bit of a fuss, so what they've got to do is they've got to combine their portions, and adding those together will result in a centre-right containment government the Conservatives are comfortable with, without recognising that these votes are actually a zero-sum game, and if they decide to unite, they'll probably get fewer votes than they would expect if they just combined their totals, because one camp doesn't like the other very much. And all these assumptions are wrong, but this is the only chance the Tories have. Because they are such a tarnished brand by their own behaviour, they have no hope of winning a national majority on their own. So anyone getting in the way of this opportunity has to be attacked. And someone who's been pushing for this in front of the cameras is Jacob Rees-Mogg. He co-hosts the Daily Tea podcast, frequently, with Camilla Tominey, Tim Stanley, and the like. And about 5 days ago, they did an episode attacking Zia Yusuf, because Zia Yusuf said that Ben Wallace, the former Defence Secretary, was a moron and a traitor. That, while he was in the Ministry of Defence, the leak happened that led to thousands of Afghans, Taliban fighters, drug addicts, people poisoned by lead and ravaged by centuries of cousin marriage, murderers, rapists, entire clans were brought over with a super injunction taken out against the public to stop them knowing. And now, men like Wayne Broadhurst are dead. Now there are women and children that have been raped by Afghan grooming gangs operating allegedly out of Norwich, or another Taliban fighter who said, he abducted a 7-year-old girl and abused her and told the court, well, he is fond of children and that that's just what they do in his country. I believe him. But Ben Wallace knew it was going on, didn't use parliamentary privilege to call it out, decided it was just A-OK, as did the rest of the Conservatives who championed the Afghan resettlement scheme, including Robert Jenrick, which is why there's some tension between Zia and Jenrick. And Ben Wallace decided to say, oh, look, a lesson from a man who never put a uniform on, just worked at a bank. Okay, despite Zia Yusuf's lack of military experience, he's never been responsible for importing millions of immigrants into the country, including thousands of Taliban fighters, murderers, and rapists, has he been? So he's right to call you out for importing thousands of Afghans to Britain without vetting at the cost of billions to the taxpayer, some of whom were Taliban fighters, others kicked out of the Afghan army for sexual misconduct, and that Ben Wallace's government took out a super injunction to keep British people in the dark. He said, your actions constitute treachery, and many serving in the military use that word to describe you. Our Boriswave inquiry will shine a bright disinfecting light on all of the above, and I will not hesitate to declassify the things you did to betray the British people. That's why you're lashing out. Tick-tock, Ben Wallace. Again, I have my criticisms of Zia. Excellent. No notes. I have reason to believe that those criticisms also made their way back to Zia at some point, and understanding the direction in which the political winds were blowing, Zia has decided to upgrade his rhetoric and policies, and you know what? Nothing but praise for it. Well done. But the Daily Tea didn't have much praise for it, and Jacob Rees-Mogg and Camilla Tominey, both of whom support the Tories, decided to use their podcast to rubbish Zia Yusuf, accuse him of being a liability, also attack Restore Britain with a bunch of tired pejoratives, and perpetuate this op that distances Zia, Restore, and anyone who is anti-Tory from Reform to make a pact with the Conservatives, which Mogg is agitating for, much more likely.
And that's why you're in trouble. And what you should have done, and I mean you personally, you should have been tasked with being the head boy, being the top prefect, who took this errant student on. You should have said, Nigel, after the election, come and have a peerage, buddy. Come back to us.
I didn't have the authority to do that.
First of all, let's just note the feminine register here. It's sitting around gossiping about the respective personalities and dynamics. And again, this is the stock and trade of politics, unfortunately, but it codes much more feminine on the Daily Tea. And also, if you notice, Camilla Tominay's proposition was, well, this is the fault of the Tories for not effectively containing Farage by making him a Tory peer after Brexit. Because if the Tories just brought Farage into the tent, you wouldn't have this problem. We wouldn't have to be brokering a Conservative reform pact out in the open and behind closed doors. So again, everything is premised on, oh, this is a bit annoying for us, this is inconvenient, we couldn't possibly have consequences for the Tories who ruin the country, we just need to do containment more effectively next time.
It seems to me Zia ultimately wants Nigel's job.
Well, so does Robert Jenrick, which is also problematic, right?
Robert isn't going to get it because Reform don't trust defectors.
No.
Being a defector is always a mug's game because the party you left dislikes you and the party you joined doesn't trust you.
Yes.
And Robert is in that position. It's very hard for him to get it. Zia is clearly the front runner if anything would happen to Nigel, or if all this talk about Nigel not being as good as he was, having taken his finger off the pulse, there's been a lot of recent criticism of Nigel, and he's just dipped below Labour in a YouGov poll.
Yes.
And Zia is waiting in the wings.
I will say, from what I understand, that's actually not true. Like, Zia Yusuf is not acting as Brutus, sharpening his blade. He's actually very loyal to Nigel Farage these days. It is true that they're both competing, him and Jenrick, to succeed Farage, and that Yusuf thought he had that line of succession locked up before Jenrick's defection. But I don't think that Zia Yusuf is eagerly trying to depose Nigel Farage. He is one of the few trusted allies that Farage has around him at this point, and again, those are very few in number. It's less than two hands.
What about Richard Tice, by the way?
Well, Richard would be an obvious candidate. He did it before. He's highly civilised. He may perhaps be too close to the Conservatives.
Oh.
He just seems to me that Richard should never have left the Conservative Party.
Probably not.
But
should any of them? I mean,
Well,
this
probably.
is the irony, right? Zia is suffering from TDS. It's not Trump derangement syndrome, although he wants to be the next Trump. It's Tory derangement syndrome. What's wrong with... You were once a Conservative.
So were lots of people, Camilla. The problem is the Conservatives were not conservative. They oversaw and inflicted everything horrible on our country, or at least they continued Blair's revolution gleefully as the heirs to Blair. And so when the Conservatives were the only party, or at least they were the party in power for 14 years, it made sense to have a Conservative Party membership, to attend the conferences, to report on it, to try and leverage influence against the House magazines, like The Times, The Telegraph, The Spectator, who were responsible for building the consensus within the Conservative Party that led to them betraying us. But when there was an alternative option, plenty of people left it. And that is why there are many ex-Tory voters and members who are now in Reform. And that is a different calibre than former Conservative ministers who were responsible for the Boriswave. Zia Yusuf, funnily enough, doesn't matter if he was a card-carrying Tory, was not in Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak's cabinet. Lots of people were, and they deserve derision, scepticism, and in my ideal world, a prison sentence.
It's a unique brand of self-loathing, isn't it? We have the same, and we'll get onto them in a minute, with like Rupert Lowe and Restore. These people fighting for ideological purity against their own type of people. Oh, you're not right-wing enough, therefore you must be rejected. It's very odd. You know, this is the problem, and Fraser Nelson's talked about it in his Substack.
Fraser Nelson is not my own type of people. Fraser Nelson thinks that immigration and demographic change are unalloyed goods. He continues to deny the costs and crimes of mass immigration, despite his ludicrous article in late 2024 saying that Britain is undergoing an integration miracle, sparking the national and then international conversation about the grooming gangs again. So Fraser Nelson is just a professional liar, and he admitted as such in 2017, advising Conservative politicians to tell voters, I hear your concerns about immigration, and then continuing to increase immigration for the GDP anyway. So no, these aren't my people. And when you say, oh, you're attacking me for not being right-wing enough. No, I'm attacking people on the basis that they don't have our people and our countries' peace and prosperity and demographic security in mind. Those are the basic preconditions for having a politics where we can discuss things like tax rates and infrastructure and energy security. If you don't agree with those foundations, then you're in no way patriotic or one of my people. We are enemies.
The problem for Farage, and he said at the press conference yesterday when asked, would you do a deal with Restore? Well, no, actually, Lowe is surrounding himself with deeply unsavoury people. I'm the one who saw off the BNP back in the day. We don't want to go back into that arena. Thank you very much. And Yusuf is constantly tagging him further rightwards, particularly on social media. So where Nigel Farage draws the line on mass deportation and ICE vans, Yusuf seems perfectly comfortable with it. Now, it could be that somebody in that party just needs to throw some red meat to keep the further righters happy. But I think it's placing Farage in a precarious position because Farage needs Waitrose women. He's got all of the people he needs on the right. He needs to convince some sort of blue wallers to come over.
Well, clearly Farage doesn't have everyone he needs on the right because Restore Britain have 150,000 members and between 3 to 7 to 8% in opinion polls when prompted. So that would push reform if you combine those two vote shares together, and I'm, again, not saying that there aren't some mutually exclusive voters in both camps, but if you were able to combine those shares, that would be national majority territory. And then also notice something that Camilla Tominey says. She implies that Zia Yusuf's usefulness in reform is to act as an agent of containment, to throw out red meat to the base, to basically say, like Fraser Nelson said, we hear your concerns on immigration, but then once you win, you don't actually do anything about it because you don't want to lose the Waitrose women, the middle-class women who are squeamish about the idea of deportations, but would actually want to live in a country where mass deportations have been conducted. They just don't want to engage in the actual difficult bit of politics, and they're easily manipulated by the media because they'll see a crying child on a German beach and think, quick, throw open the borders to every rapist from the Middle East. And also, Camilla Tominey, one of the self-described Waitrose women, said in 2023 that Rishi Sunak is basically political dynamite, so unfortunately, I don't think her political instincts are all that worthwhile. Nevertheless, look at where their priorities are. They think that Zia Yusuf is now the problem. They've already successfully isolated, cut out Restore Britain from the conversation, and now they've moved on to Zia Yusuf for being too far right. The same strategy that Nigel Farage decided to try and play against Restore Britain, calling them fascists and then getting compared to Oswald Mosley himself. They've now moved their eye onto Zia Yusuf because he is the blockage from within reform preventing a reform Conservative pact.
And he can't do that if he's going around sort of suggesting, that millions of people need to be ejected from their homes in the UK.
And don't know whether the King counts as being British or not.
Okay, millions of people do need to be ejected from the UK because it's not their homes. There are more than 1.2 million illegal immigrants here, and there are millions of legal immigrants who have either committed crimes or sponged off welfare or were never wanted. The Boriswave, for a start, 6 million in 6 years, and that is an overwhelmingly popular position. According to YouGov, 45% of voters think that not just every illegal immigrant should go, but millions of legal immigrants must also go too. And this is all when voters are underestimating immigration every year by a factor of 10. They think it's 70,000 rather than 700,000, and they think the majority of the immigrants they see in their high streets are illegals rather than legals. And they don't care about the distinction, they just want them gone. And as for the thing of, the King isn't white British, again, Rupert Lowe refused to answer that question because it was a bad faith question by Nick Robinson. The King has a unique ancestral makeup of German, Greek, and Danish, though he is related to both William the Conqueror and Harold Godwinson. So he has an ancestral tie to the land, even though our long-running joke is the royal family are foreign. But the Telegraph doesn't understand what white British means because it's a census category that you self-identify as, and it means that only people with English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish ancestry are likely to press that category because they know their own ancestry, because they're discrete ethnic groups.
That's obviously a Lowe suggestion, not a Yusuf one.
Indeed.
Yusuf hasn't been that idiotic.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a limit to where the right should ever want to go. I do not think the Conservatives would be well advised to do a deal with Restore because of Charlie Downs, because of the statements that are being tweeted out in Rupert Lowe's name.
So there you go. The entire point of rubbishing Zia Yusuf and Restore Britain is to make a pact between the Conservatives and Reform more likely. In J. Rees-Mogg's own words, who has already applied to be a Tory candidate at the next election. And this podcast gets really petty. Like, Tominey mocks Zia Yusuf for being pint-sized. She said that he's engaged in teenage rebellion. They then psychologise Nigel Farage as a lifelong outsider. All of this is because Zia refuses to reward the Tories for the Boriswave. And this is why Operation Push Zia Out of Reform is underway. On Sunday, there was the announcement that Nigel Farage will get a spot at the Remembrance Day service. But another senior Reform source, who of course is anonymous, briefed to the Mail that Nigel Farage is being urged by close allies to turn off his phone and have some rest, And they're also urging Farage to reboot the party by dismissing Zia Yusuf as Home Affairs spokesman, who apparently annoyed Mr Farage last week by describing the former Tory Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, as a traitor to Britain, for allowing into the UK thousands of Afghans who had served the UK during the war in their country. That's not true. They didn't all serve the UK. Also, that doesn't automatically entitle them to be here. And as we know, the Afghan government that we were propping up was hopelessly corrupt and engaged in buckabazi, so none of them should have been here in the first place. But also, I happen to know that Nigel Farage wasn't annoyed with Zia. He just told the Sun reporter, I'll talk to him, to get the Sun reporter to stop asking about it and piss off in Clacton. Nobody cares. But the Daily Mail is trying to give you the impression that Nigel Farage and Zia Yusuf are being dragged apart. A source said, quote, Nigel has fallen out of love with Zia, who is out of control. I think his days are numbered. Rupert Lowe only left because Zia went for him so hard over some HR nonsense. If Zia goes, Rupert could be persuaded back. Oh, curious. Okay, so there are now anonymous sources in Reform saying that they want to get Rupert back by dismissing Zia Yusuf. But that's weird, because Zia Yusuf wasn't saying that Rupert Lowe wasn't allowed back. Zia Yusuf was one of the people saying on television repeatedly that we're happy to work with Restore Britain. Zia Yusuf has actually been lifting rhetoric straight from Restore Britain and repurposing it in Reform, such as detain and deport, and we are the only anti-establishment party. And Zia's wise to this operation. He's responded, saying the Daily Mail is campaigning hard for a pact between Reform and the Tories so the Tories can suffocate us. They'll keep coming for me with this nonsense, quoting the same anonymous source, because they think I will die before I let that happen. They are correct. And also noting proposals by Tories that Labour should stand down in the second Clacton by-election to defeat Nigel Farage, as reported in the Telegraph, Zia said the obvious natural party for the dying Tory party to do a deal with is Labour. The Uniparty operate the same open borders, eye-watering tax policies, the same disdain for voters. They already conspired together to cancel elections. They'll keep conspiring against the interests of the British people. And Zia is right to be vigilant, not paranoid, because this briefing war has been going on for ages, and these anonymous sources keep attacking Zia Yusuf and Restore to block both from preventing a Conservative Reform pact. A piece in the Eye declared, before Nigel Farage did the press conference saying that Charlie Downes would have to be exiled from Restore to do a deal, the Eye quotes senior sources in Reform UK saying that Lowe's decision to retain Downes had scuppered talks and a deal is consequently not going to happen. They said for talks to happen, Downes would have to be kicked out of Restore's membership rather than just demoted as a Lowe advisor. Nigel doesn't want these kinds of people. A senior Reform insider agreed Lowe's refusal to wash his hands of the protégé had probably scuppered a deal with Farage. And then that same insider accused Zia Yusuf of being a loose cannon, saying he does say things that don't look particularly sensible. They said that while Yusuf communicates extremely well, he needed to stop shooting from the hip. He would do very well in Parliament, provided he could be prevailed upon to think about what he's going to say before he actually says it. Now, Restore Britain have noticed this factional infighting. A senior Restore source said, and I don't know who this was, by the way, we focus on policy, they seem to be interested in personality. The source named Zia Yusuf as one who is quite keen for an alliance. They said, from what I understand, they're having internal factional fighting, with Zia on one side and former Tories on the other, and Farage is somewhere in the middle. There's this factional war going on, let's see what comes of it. Yusuf told the iPaper he's not pushing for a pact, but he said, I have huge respect for Restore voters who are patriots that want secure borders and the mass deportation of illegal migrants. These will be my highest priority as Home Secretary. Reform will work hard to earn their votes so we have a majority, we actually need to deliver it. So Zia Yusuf refuses to insult Restore Britain and Restore voters because he realises the overlap in policy, and he realises that they are voters that Reform should never have estranged in the first place, either through their rhetoric on mass deportations or Yusuf's own behaviour towards Rupert Lowe. And it is this uncompromising position on mass deportations and his refusal to make a bogeyman out of Restore Britain, and his unwillingness to work with the Tories, that has the same outlets, the Telegraph, the Spectator, the Times, even enemy outlets like the Observer, attacking him. You've got Stephen Pollard, the same Stephen Pollard, by the way, who wrote a hit piece on Charlie Downes for the Telegraph, and was formerly the research director of the Fabian Society, writing that Yusuf has a habit of making inflammatory accusations which are bad enough in themselves, but are especially inappropriate at a time when politicians of all stripes have been subjected to violent attacks. Oh really? You think accusing people of being Nazis and Oswald Mosley and fascists and far-right and racists and anti-Semites might put their lives at risk, Stephen? Why did you do the same to Charlie Downes in your Telegraph piece then? Why has the Telegraph and the Spectator done the same for Restore Britain? You don't care about that. You just want to find an excuse to hoist Zia Yusuf by Reform's own petard. The more one sees and hears from Yusuf, the more obvious it becomes that he is a liability for Reform. He then lists the police report filed against Rupert Lowe and Zia's crash out over Sarah Pochin's question about banning the burqa, which he then resigned and then rejoin the party over. And again, those are fair criticisms. I make the criticisms of Zia, and these are things that he should express remorse for. But these aren't the principled objections that Stephen Pollard, the Telegraph, and the Spectator have of Zia Yusuf. It's that he refuses to be polite and conciliatory to people who have betrayed and ruined the country. He says, Yusuf behaves as if anyone who disagrees with him is not only wrong, a not unreasonable stance for a politician, but despicable for being wrong because they are morally bad people. Well, they frequently are. In January, he wrote on X that he found the way political opponents are often friendly with each other behind the scenes before TV interviews sickening. Yes, so do I. Like, for example, why was I expected to be chummy with Dennis McShane when I had to share a GB News panel with him, when he had previously said that he knew about the grooming gangs but didn't say anything because he didn't want to rock the multicultural boat as a Guardian reading liberal lefty? Like, sorry, I don't care if your ideological sensitivities matter more to you than the innocence of abused children. I think you're reprehensible for not speaking up about that, and I won't pretend otherwise. Pollard complains it's a sentiment that Yusuf enlarged on in May when he posted, recent events demonstrate why I view the Tory and Labour politicians who created the burning injustice of modern Britain as traitors to their country. A reckoning is coming. Basic common courtesy appears to Yusuf to be a sign of depravity, a stance which he might be wealthy enough to pull off in his private life, which marks him down as a liability in public life. The more the public sees of Zia Yusuf, I am convinced, the more difficult it will become for reform to convert a poll lead into government. Yeah, because Zia Yusuf because Zia Yusuf refuses to work with the Tories, which you would quite like them to do, isn't it, Stephen? This makes me more sympathetic than anything for Zia Yusuf. His refusal to play footsie with the Tories that have done demographic damage to our country is actually a mark of favour for his character. And no better endorsement is there than to have the disapproval of Fraser Nelson. And someone in Reform, again an anonymous source, so a traitor within Reform talking to a traitor, Fraser Nelson, says, Nigel knows he's made a big mistake. He knows how bad the 5 million from Holborn looks and that it's cutting through to the voters. And so some in Reform, talking to Fraser Nelson, are speculating whether or not Reform would collapse without Nigel Farage. But Nelson, licking his lips, said that Reform is still a force for hope for millions who view the established parties with contempt, so his departure would not be an extinction-level event for Reform, it might even be a chance for renewal. He just can't wait for the prospect of getting Nigel Farage out the way. A recent survey of party supporters show the race would be between Zia Yusuf and Richard Tice. Robert Jenrick, who defected from the Tories, is mistrusted by Reform members and seemingly reviled by Yusuf. And so Nelson fears the contest would pose a directional dilemma. Does Reform continue to keep its recent theme of racial politics, saying the white man is discriminated against? We are, from the Equality Act to the Companies Act to the Malicious Communications Act and associated racially aggravated public order offences, and also talking about banning Muslim burqa and the Sikh kirpan, or should it tilt to the centre to stand the best chance of governing? Yet again, what we see is a redefinition of what governing looks like, what election victories look like by the Tory press, the Times, the Telegraph and the Spectator, as being the centre, so more mass immigration, and working with the same Tories that destroyed the country and lost the last election, that caused Reform to come into being. And Nelson's chief complaint is directed at Zia Yusuf, who is glazing just a year earlier. He says Yusuf's approach, denouncing opponents as traitors, threatening to build deportation camps in parts of the country that don't vote Reform, delights social media but unnerves wavering voters. Some see Yusuf as a loose cannon, toxifying and worse, loose-lipped. And there are people who have been talking to the likes of Sebastian Payne, who is just Michael Gove's clone. He worked for Michael Gove, he looks like Michael Gove, he now writes the Times, just like Michael Gove used to. There are people within Reform complaining about Zia Yusuf's mannerisms and engaging in subterfuge trying to get him kicked out. Again, this is a consistent pattern. Zia Yusuf is standing in the way of the Tories getting back into government via Reform, and so he and Restore Britain must have their reputations rubbished and cut out of the body politic, in Allister Heath's words. There is a schism within the party about its direction, Payne writes. Some, notably its Home Affairs spokesman Zia Yusuf, wants to embrace the paranoid style as identified by the political scientist Richard Hofstadter when examining Barry Goldwater in the 1964 US presidential election. A conspiratorial worldview that finds enemies everywhere. Well, the Tories did make it a target-rich environment. You can see this in Yusuf's attacks on the media, branding his rivals as traitors and his constant war with the amorphous establishment. If there were ever a face of the establishment, it's Sebastian Payne, the doughy-faced Tory boy, who has been the Igor to Michael Gove's Dr. Frankenstein. There is a reason why some in Reform think Yusuf is a menace, as one senior counsellor described him, and his acolytes need to be contained, even banished from the party, directly saying Zia Yusuf and those who like him need to be contained and banished, because they're getting in the way of a Tory pact. Another faction within Reform the same people that hate Zia Yusuf, argues for a less rebarbative, more reasoned approach. These folks are the former Conservatives whom Yusuf openly loathes. Again, are you trying to make us sympathise with them? They argue privately the use of racial politics was necessary to see off Rupert Lowe's Restore, containment, but the party ultimately needs to appeal to the centre to have any chance of winning. You'll find the ex-Tory MPs Robert Jenrick and Danny Kruger on this side, along with Layla Cunningham. So, the wet, who are not corresponding to Reform's own voter base whatsoever, because Reform's own voter base, 70% of whom told Eric Kaufman, find that being white is an important part of their identity. They define Britain as an ethnic, not a civic community. They believe that Islam can never integrate into British society. They believe it's fundamentally incompatible with our identity, our values and customs and traditions. And they believe that not only has diversity destroyed British identity, but mass immigration must be reversed via remigration, not just illegals, but lots of legals too. The same Danny Kruger, who just today, at time of recording, said that there should be a gold rush for immigrants to go and claim British citizenship if they want to continue receiving benefits, because Reform have just announced that no foreign national will be eligible for benefits, even if they have settled status in Britain. So Danny Kruger said, well, if you want to continue receiving subsidies from the taxpayer to stay in our country, you should just get a British passport and then we'll keep paying you. Who do you think is on board? Who in Reform's voter base do you think is on board for this?
So it wouldn't necessarily provide the saving that you're looking for?
Well, we're not expecting that everybody will simply cease to receive benefits, and you're right. In fact, we would encourage people who are living and working here, who've been here for a long time, who regard Britain as their home, who have genuine loyalty to this country, to join us, to apply for a passport, become a British citizen, and then have full entitlement to our welfare system.
And do your figures take that into account?
Well, you'll see, the full plan is being published.
No, actually, I don't think anyone should be entitled to move over to another country and then expect to become a burden on that country's taxpayers. I wouldn't dream of going to another country and demanding welfare whether or not I became a citizen. I think that if you're born abroad and don't have any British ancestry, you shouldn't be eligible for claiming any welfare. Either pay your way or get out of my country. And most Reform voters think that, but for some reason, Danny Kruger thinks it would be immoral, racist, far-right to do so. Now, I would wager that if you propose that to Zia Yusuf, he would say that was sensible. He even corrected Robert Jenrick when he was live on Sky News, saying that actually, no, we are going to expel foreign nationals from social housing. There isn't going to be any special carve-outs for foreign nationals to live in houses at British taxpayers' expense, because that would be absurd. But apparently, the kinds of people who think Zia Yusuf is going too far with his rhetoric on Twitter, is being too mean to the Tories, also think that foreign nationals should be able to come over to your country, get a British passport as if it's just a worthless piece of paper, and then take your stuff. Funnily enough, I don't. And if you do, and Zia doesn't, well, then I'm going to side with Zia over you. And again, in The Observer, another anonymous Reform source is trying to use the press to hound Zia Yusuf out of the party, presumably because he's against the Tories. A source told The Observer that there were some serious splits within the party that are going to break at any point. Yusuf has already been a figure of frustration for many within Reform, culminating in his resignation after he publicly criticised Sarah Pochin. One source said that they are trying to make personal pleas to Farage to re-adopt red lines on far-right extremism and remove trigger-happy Yusuf from his role. Zia's a big problem, they said. Some in the party are concerned Yusuf is part of a rightward push. God forbid a political party on the right be right-wing. Prompted by fears that Rupert Lowe's Restore was outflanking them. One senior source said, "We were definitely spooked by Restore, and I don't think it was our finest hour. Nigel can carry on the Yusification of Reform, or he can rely on his instincts to keep Tommy Robinson well beyond where Reform stands, but he has got to make that decision." Weird that it's Tommy Robinson that's like the bogeyman, because, again, Tommy Robinson's quite pro-Israel, and he's pro-Sikh and Hindu Indian migration, so he's significantly, to the left of plenty of people they could otherwise use as sticks to beat Reform with. It's almost like this is rhetoric coming from someone who's terminally Westminster-brained. It's almost like similar rhetoric was used in the piece in the Telegraph, where an anonymous Reform source said that Charlie Downs would have to be expelled from Restore before Reform and Restore would even talk. They actually said, "We're happy to talk, but you can't do that when there are people in the party like Charlie Downs." This all started with the Groypers in the US, and it's happening here, putting out this anti-Jewish stuff that's very similar to the far left. That's very sort of terminally Westminster-coded language. It's the sort of person that, again, reads Melanie Phillips' or Fraser Nelson's columns in the Times, reads Allister Heath's pieces in the Telegraph, goes to unheard events and takes the idea of the Nick Fuentesification of British politics very, very seriously. You know, because the greatest threat to Britain is young men in their 20s doing podcasts, making jokes on the internet, not complete demographic annihilation. The source said to The Observer, reform shouldn't panic. There's lots of evidence we're still the main contender on the right, but the scale of tactical voting and persistence of it should be our focus, not Rupert. So your focus should be tactical voting. So an electoral coalition with the Tories, banishing Zia Yusuf and rejecting Rupert Lowe to make sure that happens. How interesting. And this is why the anonymous reform source is rumoured to be Tim Montgomerie, because Montgomerie really doesn't like Zia Yusuf. He keeps responding to Zia, especially when Zia called Ben Wallace a moron and a traitor, saying, "This isn't acceptable. I don't agree with Ben Wallace on the issue, but Zia's language and attitude towards any opponent is inappropriate and counterproductive. Opponents are opponents, they aren't enemies or morons." One of the biggest question marks over Nigel Farage's leadership is whether he brings Zia under control, if he contains him. Zia Yusuf is a man of huge talents, but too much of his social media output is intemperate and reinforces reform's number one problem, our negative tactical voting challenge. Right, okay, so Tim's principal concern is that Zia Yusuf is wasting his talents, you know, as previous anonymous reform sources have said, and that he is preventing a tactical voting pact with the Conservatives. Oh, how interesting. That sounds quite familiar, doesn't it? Tim Montgomerie also tweeted a little while ago, "I don't think Tories hating on reform have any idea to the extent to which they're pushing people like me further and further away." And David Gauke, the former Conservative minister, who crashed out over Brexit, said, "I love how subtle you are having a go at Zia Yusuf," and Tim Montgomerie put a wink in response. So again, Tim Montgomerie is openly criticising Zia Yusuf for refusing to be conciliatory towards the same Tories that destroyed the country, because he's blocking a tactical pact with the Conservatives, which Tom Montgomerie, having previously been an editor at Conservative Home, previously founded Unheard, previously being a Conservative, then defected over to Reform, clearly wants to broker from within Reform. And then Tim also responded to Kemi Bademont, calling Nigel Farage woke, saying, "Kemi's been on the sauce, but in all seriousness, the Tory leader's increasingly ridiculous antagonism to reform is her biggest mistake. Division on the right is Andy Burnham's biggest advantage." Right. So he is of the opinion that there should be an original position where the Tories and Reform are of the same party, like the Daily Tea podcasts, like the Telegraph is saying, like the Times is saying, like the Spectator is saying. This is the person within Reform, apparently, that wants the Tories and Reform to merge and is taking a dislike to Zia Yusuf's strong rhetoric about it. At the same time, there are all these anonymous leaks who are very well connected to the press, both left and right, or ostensibly right alike, who keep complaining about Zia Yusuf in the exact same fashion, who use language like the Groypers, whoa, to attack Restore Britain. And what was really weird as well is Tim Montgomerie hates Matt Goodwin's guts. He said there was a whiff of sulphur about him after Tim defected to Reform. But then he agrees with Matt Goodwin, who also hates Restore on a personal level, that there should be no accord between Reform and Restore, and instead Reform should be chasing Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat votes. I'm not exaggerating, that's what Matt Goodwin put in his Substack. And Tim says, "I agree with every word of the below" from Matt. And just as I finish filming, The Spectator releases a new episode of Coffee House Shots with Tim Montgomerie, using the exact same language as the Reform anonymous sources did, counter-signalling Zia Yusuf, saying that Nigel Farage has fallen out of love with Zia, as was reported in the Mail, and announcing he's launching a new in-house Reform platform, presumably to continue agitating against Zia Yusuf on behalf of seeking a tactical voting accord with the Conservatives. Why this guy's still allowed in, God knows. So it just seems conspicuous that there is an op going on in the Tory press to push Zia Yusuf out of Reform, to get Nigel Farage to use the same slurs and smears they were using against him just last year when some non-credible former classmate came out of the woodwork and said, "Oh, he made jokes about the Holocaust at school," and to push Restore Britain away from Reform to vacate the seat in a prospective coalition or non-aggression pact for the same Conservatives who brought the Boriswave on us. So I just have to urge those watching in Reform, and I know that there are people in Reform, both supporters and in the HQ, that watch this show, don't get fooled again, because we certainly don't want to be.